Hey everybody, it's Jenny from GrowthMode Marketing. You're listening to Demand Gen Fix, the podcast where our team of growth moders and our guests discuss the ins and outs of demand generation and why we believe it's the key to long-term sustainable growth, especially in the HR tech industry. Hey everybody, welcome to the Demand Gen Fix podcast. This is episode 8. I'm Jenny from GrowthMode Marketing, and I'm back with Erica and Deanna. And today we're going to be talking about how you can define an ideal customer profile. If you've done your homework and created a good one, you'll know exactly what type of companies are the best fit for your products and services. You can then use that information to create content that's highly relevant to this audience and attracts the right buyers for your solutions. Let's just jump right in by talking about what exactly is an ideal customer profile.
I think in the most basic description, it's your best fit customer.
It's a type of company. So it's the company or the profile of companies that you feel like are most likely to buy your products or services. Ultimately, it's a representation of your ideal client. So focused on that company or that account versus the person or the profile within.
Right. And I think typically an ideal customer profile, like a lot of people could argue, well, there's my total addressable market is clearly my ideal customer profile because they're the ones who are most likely to buy. But I think it's much more, nuanced than that. And you're really getting focused in. And of course, we can kind of talk about how you focus in and what that looks like. But when you're thinking about ideal customer profiles, I think one thing that's important is how you use it. And I would say, typically these are going to be used at the beginning of a sales and marketing process. It's going to help you identify and hone in on who that best fit target audience of prospects is that you should be going after. And it's going to look at things like business triggers, product use cases, and key organizational characteristics. And what you do with that is you go out and you find those companies and you create content that attracts those type of companies to you.
At GrowthMode, we have a lot of clients that have done buyer personas, and they're going to say, well, what's the difference between this buyer persona that we have and this ideal customer profile?
That's a really good question, Jenny. And I think this comes up in almost every new project that we kick off where we talk through, have you identified your ideal customer profile? And people come back with that or kind of a mesh between the two. It's really important to realize that the ideal customer profile is focused on the company. Your buyer persona is more focused within that company. Who's the individual buyer or that profile of person within the company who is going to be, making the decision or influencing the decision. The buyer persona is looking more so at that focusing on the person again and not the company. So I think that's something that a lot of times people don't realize the difference, but there's definitely a fine line between the two. And we find this conversation really comes up a lot at the beginning of project.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, and both of them are important and play a role in how you use them and what you do with that data. But really, it's like, think about it at a really high level. The ideal customer profile, that's about the type of companies that you're targeting and you're trying to attract. The buyer persona, those are the individuals within those companies and how they think and operate, and how do you work through the sales process with them. So one comes into play further down the road, that buyer persona, versus the ideal customer profile, where that's the defining point. You got to find those companies before you worry about the individual buyer that's in there.
And that sounds like that's why your ideal customer profile is so important to identify at the beginning of your process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in a really cluttered market like the HR technology space and many other markets out there, narrowing down your focus can really help you increase your traction. And using the example of the HR technology space, there's over 21,000 HR technology vendors out there, and they're all competing for a piece of the HR tech budget. So you might look at it and say, well, that's a payroll company. We don't compete against that platform. We work on recruitment solutions. But guess what? might be the same budget it's coming out. So in a sense, you are competing against all these other platforms that are out there when that chief people officer, that chief HR officer is determining, what their budget is and how they're going to use it for throughout the year. And so your messaging can get lost in the crowd. And I think people can be overwhelmed by that when they are out there in the market looking at all the solutions that are out there. So an ideal customer profile really can be valuable in those cases because what it's helping you do is focus in on your audience to allow you to get hyper-focused with your messaging so it stands out in that sea of sameness.
That's a really good point, Deanna. And I think really highlighting the fact that this is an ideal customer profile and it is allowing you to really get hyper-focused and switch your messaging in the direction towards that particular audience. So it allows you to really come up with a message that resonates directly with those ideal customers versus trying to be everything to everybody and really getting in front of this huge total addressable market. And rather than doing that, it really just allows you to kind of hone in and key your message towards those people that you feel like are the best fit for your company, for your products and solutions.
Let's talk about what goes into an ideal customer profile. We know what goes into buyer personas. Is it the same type of information that goes into an ideal customer profile, or is it slightly different?
I think it's a little bit different. You're taking a look at the firmographic, and those are details about the ideal company that you want to target, including the size of it, the revenue they bring in, their industry, their location, their customer base. Then you've got the technographics, and that focuses on systems, integration requirements, the keys to making the product work. Often these also include details about the complementary technologies that make your product work even better. And then there's the buying triggers. And these traits are often time-bound or situational. They indicate a readiness to convert. Some examples of buying triggers are a new round of funding, for example, or a merger or an acquisition, a new CEO at the helm, expansion of the company. All of those kinds of things are things that you're looking at when starting to think about who your ideal customer profile is.
Yeah. And, I think things like mergers and acquisitions, like a lot of people could say, okay, that's probably a buying trigger. Not necessarily. I think as you dig in and you do the research for your ideal customer profile, you're going to find different companies, depending on what your products and services are and who you're really trying to target, may have different triggers than some of these obvious ones, like the company's expanding or they're going through an acquisition, things like that.
Let's go into more on how you actually create the ideal customer profile. So what are kind of the steps?
I think that first and foremost, you need to analyze the numbers, right? Think about the numbers that you already have in your database. So you're analyzing your quantitative data. And that's your past clients, your present clients. There's all kinds of different numbers that you can dig into.
Yeah. So things like, what is the length of the sales cycle? What is the quicker end of that close? Something to think about there. Or your customer acquisition cost, satisfaction level, starting to look at some of that. Does the company do any sort of surveying to see satisfaction levels or net promoter scores? What is your overall length of a relationship with a client? Those are some other things I think about.
If they renew business with you on a regular basis, the size of the deal, the profitability, all of anything that you can put down in numbers. I think that's the first thing to take a look at. But then there's so much more to it too. I mean, there's not just the number portion. We also want to talk about the qualitative data. And so that's something that you reach out to the rest of your team for.
Yeah, before we jump into the qualitative data, let's talk a little bit more about the quantitative data. I think a lot of organizations will say, that's great. How do I get that? And, the reality is sometimes that information is easier said than done, but I think it's really important to, make an effort to get it. However, the reality can be that your data is only as good as what's been entered into your sales CRM. So if you don't have sales reps who are accurately recording, like when they first start talking to a lead, for example, it's it's going to be really hard to indicate the length of sales cycle and dig into that. If you don't do customer satisfaction surveys, you're going to have a really hard time looking at each individual client and saying, here's the customer satisfaction level, looking at those kind of things. So I think it's a matter of going and figuring out how much of this data can we capture and how can we kind of slice it out by client to really have something to compare client over client with. And it's not just, here's the current clients, like look at your past and present clients, because the more data you can have, what you can do with that is you can start to look at the numbers and compare these different companies to each other and say, okay, you know what? This company, their length of sales cycle, like when we find a company like this, they actually close pretty quickly. That's really good information to know, because guess what? When you're behind on revenue, what are the type of companies you want to be targeting? Not the ones that are going to take 18 months to close, but the ones that are going to take 3 months to close, because it's going to be a faster way to add revenue, to the bottom line. So I think it's really important, not to gloss over the numbers, but to find, the data and where there are commonalities across clients and where there are standouts. Then you take it to that next level, and that's about collecting that qualitative data from your internal team, because it's like, okay, we have an idea if we just look at the numbers, like these type of clients seem to be our best. Let's go talk to our team that actually works with them to see, because if you've got someone that's really hard to work with, they're probably not the kind of client you want to continue to attract, right?
Right. I think that's a huge thing. It probably every agency, every company, I'm sure everyone deals with people that are hard to work with. And then you have other people that you work with that are amazing and you just absolutely love working with them. And obviously that's the kind of client you want to attract.
Yeah. And one could argue there's a personality factor there, and you can't pick companies based on personalities, but it's more of when you're looking at like this client's hard to work with or this one's really easy to work with, it's more about like sometimes the org structure and the roles that you have access to and how political those organizations are likely to be internally. Like if you've got an organization, like companies love to sell to Fortune 500 companies. Sometimes there's so many layers of management and roles within those organizations that they can be more difficult to work with, simply because you have to navigate all those things as a vendor of that organization. Whereas smaller organizations, potentially, depending on, how you're working with them and what you're selling, but potentially it might be simpler to make a sale in there and to have day-to-day contact with that organization.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that it really comes down to asking some of the questions, who are the best customers to work with? Who's the most difficult customers to work with? Or maybe it's more of the ongoing support that causes difficulties, but not just asking these types of questions, but also asking why, like starting to uncover why do you feel like this about certain groups of customers, and really get as much of a comprehensive look at sort of what your internal team is feeling in order to really start to kind of complete that picture that you're painting.
I think it's also important to think about how companies think about you too.
Right.
It's not just about what you think about working with them, but do these companies like working with you, and do they like how your processes work and that kind of thing? Because obviously there's two sides to every coin.
And then thinking about, do you have clients that are out there advocating for your products or services, or who are a promoter or an influencer of your solutions, somebody that you can rely on for that kind of thing, or to, reference your products in different ways? I think that's something else that comes up a lot, and you should be looking at and asking why. And then also, who's putting the most value on your product. So who really truly feels the strongest about the value that you're offering, whether it's in your technology, your HR technology platform, or just a software platform, or it's a service. Who puts the most value there and feels like strongly about the value that your company is bringing to their organization?
Right. And I think it's about digging deep. So understanding if they're an advocate for you, if they're going out and they're a raving fan, why?
Right.
Are there situational things about their experience? Is it because they have a certain technology that your HR technology platform integrates with really well? And so it creates more excitement around it. Like really digging in, not just, oh, my account manager has a great relationship with me, therefore I love your company. Like it's got to go deeper than that. And, I think sometimes there's themes that if you start talking and looking at these companies and finding out where companies are similar in their organizational structure, in the technology that they have, in the industry that they have, things like that, like that's where there's really powerful knowledge to be able to hone in on your ideal customer profile, because it's not about necessarily the individual personalities working in an organization and the ability to, have a good, customer service rep client relationship. It's much deeper than that.
So once you've looked at the numbers, the quantitative data, and you've looked at the qualitative data, how then, like how do you narrow it down, or how far do you narrow it down? Is there a perfect number of ideal clients that you have now that you want to kind of take a look at, or what is the best way to really take those two things and start to identify who your best customer is?
Well, it's going to depend on how big your client portfolio is, right? Because some organizations are going to have hundreds, maybe thousands of clients that they can evaluate the data and really find the trends. And then if you're, more in startup phase or younger as a company and not as large, you're not going to have as big of a, database of information to go after. So I think, you kind of how many customers you identify or companies that fit that ideal profile is really going to depend on what you have to work with. But at a bare minimum, I would say find, 10 companies that seem to have common themes that are aligning, where you're like, if we could have more companies just like this, let's understand what it is about them, how they were thinking on their side to help us refine that ideal customer profile even more. It's not always going to be your biggest customer, which I think is something people naturally jump to when we talk to organizations and we're like, let's identify your target audience. They might be like, we're going to go after airlines. Okay, why? Well, because we're working with Delta Airlines and they're our biggest client. We could have more of those because we feel like we're doing an amazing job with them. That would be, the frosting on the cake. It would be amazing if we could go after them. And it's like, hold on a sec. Just because they're your biggest client doesn't actually mean that they're the best one to consistently go out and try to find. When you're looking at your ideal customer profile and you evaluate all the factors, I think ideally for that profile of a company, you want them to be easy to sell to, for example, they have the right issues, they have big enough need or pain point that they feel they must address it, and they know they need a solution, and I think there's other factors to consider in that as well.
One of my favorites would be that they're easy to manage. So once you've sold to them and you start to work with this customer, are they easy to manage? So do they see and experience the value in your products or solutions? Are they happy, and is it a breeze to work with them? So what makes it easy to work with these people? That's something I think that sometimes people overlook.
And are they profitable? I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer, but that's definitely a thing you need to talk about. I mean, they need to be able to pay the price and not question the value that they're getting.
It's not just looking at the revenue they bring in to say, of course they're profitable. Sometimes these really complex clients actually require so much hand-holding and so much staff resources beyond what you would expect should be needed, that they're not as good of a client as somebody that maybe pays less in revenue, but is much easier to work with. I think another thing from a profitability standpoint is how likely are they to renew with you? Are they going to question when renewals come up, or are they looking at this as a long-term relationship? Because those long-term partners, the total lifetime value of that customer is going to be, a factor that you should think about as you're looking at the profitability of a company, for sure.
Once you've identified these best customers, from 5 to 10 to 20 of your ideal customer profile, what's the next step? What do we do?
So once those are identified and you feel, the organization has come to an agreement that is who you feel like is truly the best fit, then you really want to start to identify contacts within and start to talk to those people. Find out what reasons they have that they choose solutions like yours, or what happens within their organization that triggers the search of these different types of solutions or products. Talking to them about how did they learn about your company, just really starting to pick their brains and understand a little bit more from that client's perspective.
Yeah, I think a really good one that you're having a conversation with those companies about is the how did you learn about our company, and what industry resources are you going to find your information? Because when you're building out a demand generation strategy, you want to get your really good focused content that was designed specifically to attract this ideal customer profile out in all of the places that these companies and the individual buyers within these companies are going to for their resources. And it's not necessarily like always, I went online and I did a Google search, like it's much more nuanced than that. I think, they might have gone to a Shuram conference and had conversations with their peers. Okay, well, how do we get the word out and make sure, the people at that conference are talking about us, or they're listening to a podcast, or they're going to G2 or Trustpilot or some other review site. Like there's all these different places that people can be going. And if you can find themes across these companies that you've identified that fit into that ideal customer profile, you can start to weave together a picture of here's the places we need our content to be showing up so that they know we exist, we create some brand awareness, and we're popping up everywhere they're going. But 2, we're building trust because we're in the places and we're a part of the conversation where they're going to look for advice and ideas and, understanding of what's out there and available to them.
You can also start to ask them about things like what was most important when you were evaluating solutions. So not just our current solutions or products, but when you're looking at us against other people, start to ask them questions like that and understand what were they looking for? What were they evaluating us against? Who specifically, you can also talk to them about who within the organization was involved in these conversations and decision making.
Find out their org structure. Because what if you find HR departments or, technology departments that are arranged a certain way or have certain roles? What if there's themes there? Like we've got this HR position and other organizations don't. So now you start finding organizations that have this particular position are more likely to buy your product. That needs to be part of your ideal customer profile.
I think you can start to ask them also about, how they use your product, or what made them choose your product and why they might recommend it to somebody else in their industry, to another colleague? And then in that same vein, what do the competitive products and solutions lack that yours has? So really kind of narrowing down what made them choose you in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, I think the deeper you can dig, the more information you can gather from these people, the more informed you can be in really refining out that ideal customer profile. And it doesn't mean you go and you have these 5-hour meetings with them. You can actually cover a lot of information if you ask the right questions within an hour of having a conversation with these people, and if you're having multiple conversations, again, it's where do we find the themes? Where are the ahas of the conversations we're having? And then you take all this information from the conversations you had with your internal team, the conversations you had with those companies that you identified as ideal fits, and the quantitative data that you collected on everything, and you marry it all together. And with that, you should be able to define a really clear profile of buying triggers, key characteristics of organizations, and details that you need to know to be able to clearly outline, like, this is the ideal customer to go after.
And then once you have that, then that's when you can start to really build your marketing around those people. You can really start to drive your content to those people and those companies that you've now identified as your ideal customer.
When you feel like, okay, now we really know this audience, we know exactly what their pain points were, we know, the types of things that came up in that buying process when they chose your solution, what are their buying triggers? We can really start to create our own content around that and really focus in on their pain points, focus in on those topics and messages. And then just knowing those buying triggers makes the whole content creation aspect so much simpler for an organization. And quite frankly, at GrowthMode, if we have an ideal customer profile, whether we've built that out for a company or they have one when they come to work with us, this is something, it just makes it so much easier to get up and running with a content strategy and then to form a demand gen strategy around that audience specifically. And rather than guessing as we start to create content and, building and testing all these different messages, we really know which message to kind of focus on. And it just honestly makes that process a lot simpler from the get-go as far as content creation goes.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think what happens a lot of times in organizations, they go and they build these ideal customer profiles, these buyer personas, things like that. And then they put it on a shelf and they never actually do anything with it. And, the way you're talking about it, Erica, and the way we recommend using it with clients at Growth Mode Marketing is we're taking this is a living, breathing document, and we're making sure we're applying it as we're building out your content strategy, because everything that we're going to create for you or that you're going to create from a content perspective needs to be targeted and very focused to this ideal customer profile. And with that, you're no longer going out there and trying to be everything to everybody. Because the whole point of having an ideal customer profile is you get more focused with your messaging to talk specifically to those people with the goal of attracting more of those best fit companies to use as a catalyst to growth for your organization.
Not only the creation of the content, but really understanding where to distribute the content and getting this message out to the right channels. So I think Jenny had mentioned earlier on about identifying those channels and understanding, use that time in interviewing these clients and asking them questions to understand where they're finding information, where they're searching for these types of products. And now that we know, based on those conversations, we know where these prospects are going for their information, that's where we need to be. And from a demand gen perspective, that makes our lives a lot easier, understanding where these channels are, where our prospects are going to be, and then really just catering that message and tone of those different pieces of content appropriately for the channel, whether that's social, peer review sites, a podcast, or if that's conferences or trade shows, things like that. Being able to understand where to distribute your content also becomes a lot easier.
I know we've talked about it in other podcasts, and we'll probably talk about it in more podcasts, but I think that then the next step is to develop your unique point of view. You need to resonate with these companies that you've now identified. And to do that, you need to develop a unique and impactful point of view that you can cut through that crowded space that we talked about before. You need to get through to them, and so that your prospects know you and remember you and value your name and your company when it's time for them to buy.
Yeah, and we probably should have brought up the unique point of view before we started talking about the content, because when we're working with clients, we will start with the ideal customer profile. The next thing we're going to look at is that unique point of view and how do you build out that story. And it's going to be very intentionally targeted to that ideal customer profile. Then we get to the content stage where we're like, okay, let's build out this really solid content engine using the framework we developed for your unique point of view. And we're going to go balls to the walls and start to push that content out there in all the places that we found during our ideal customer profile exercise that people are going to find their content, and really it's all working together.
Right. And then another thing I think that we don't want to be overlooked either is that once you've done this work and you really identify that ideal customer profile, it also makes being able to build a list for account-based marketing or ABM, it makes that a lot simpler too internally to be able to say, okay, this is the ideal customer profile. Now, I know what these traits are. I know these different characteristics of these best fit companies for me. So we can start to go out and actually build out that list of companies that we want to target specifically, and then build that our ABM strategy around that and knowing that ideal customer profile.
Yeah, totally. I think that's one of the pieces as you build everything else out and you get to it's time to do account-based marketing. Who do we target? That ideal customer profile is the first place I'm going to look, because you start to build out a list of companies that, as best you can tell, fit into that ideal customer profile. So now your ABM strategy complements everything else you're doing and kind of takes things to the next level. So there's, obviously there's a lot of things that we think you should be using your ideal customer profile for. The first step is creating that ideal customer profile and really doing it well. And then from there, there's so much you can do with that data to be a smarter marketer and to really build the demand generation engine that will get results for you and will help you get on that journey to high growth.
Thanks for joining us on the Demand Gen Fix, a podcast for HR tech marketers, brought to you by GrowthMode Marketing. We sure hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe for more perspectives on demand generation and B2B marketing strategies. Plus, give us a like. Tell your friends. We'll see you next time.